When I first saw this Balrog wannabe strafing an arena with a powerful extrusion of lightning fire in the shadow of the Erdtree trailer, I assumed the fight itself would be less cinematic than what the purposefully curated preview showed. After dying innumerable times to Bayle and finally making it into Phase 2 and encountering it for myself, I knew I was wrong. The reality of the fight is every bit as epic as the trailer promised. Bayle's fight took my breath away. It's a showstopper that marries visual spectacle and technical ingenuity. The question then arose, is this FromSoft's best modern dragon? Now let me pause here and caveat this all. This is a matter of opinion. I'm going to share mine and explain my thinking, but I'm not suggesting these are objective truths or that your opinions are wrong. That out of the way, I've thought carefully about Midir, Placidusax, and Bayle. In my opinion, Bayle now sits atop the pinnacle of FromSoftware's dragons. I'm going to first look at these dragons from a fight perspective, and then discuss camera dynamics. I am going to confine the discussion to Dark Souls 3 onwards, just because I haven't played the Dark Souls 1 and 2 in a really long time, and I don't feel like I'm qualified to discuss them in detail right now. The dragons in the base game of Dark Souls 3 are trash. The Ancient Wyvern is a gimmick fight, and the gimmick, which is running through a billion enemies and doing a drop plunge that one-shots him, is hardly a good time. Fighting him without the gimmick is a tedious nightmare. The King of the Storm represents some of the most abysmal camera work in the catalog, so the emergence of Midir on the scene in the DLC felt like a flash of inspiration. Midir is incredible. He's easily got the silver medal in my book. Midir doesn't spend a ton of time in the air, which is important because the more airtime there is, the less combative engagement you're afforded. We get to be up in Midir's face, but we have to work to get there. Midir is highly mobile, keeping you alert and on your toes. The aesthetics of this fight are incredible. The dark purple hues and the graphic texture of his body make him the most visually outstanding of the dragons. There's also a genuine ferocity that admirably approximates the terror we're supposed to fear. A good dragon should be able to make massive attacks appropriate to its massive body. The challenge is to accomplish this without diminishing player engagement. Midir excels here. By using forward dashing enormous slash attacks like this, and through fire attacks like this, and arena crossing charge attacks like this, Midir manages to number large-scale moves among his arsenal of maneuvers that don't require you to just constantly run away. One or two running away and waiting moves are fine in my book, but I find it tedious when this happens too often. My ideal fight requires movement with the boss rather than movement from the boss, and Midir's fight balances epic scale and mobility almost perfectly. Midir does have a few strikes against him, as all of these do. One is his fairly limited moveset. This is more a consequence of FromSoftware's evolution over time, in turn dictated by the increasing sophistication of technology. Newer enemies have the capacity for more complexity that just didn't really exist 10 years ago. I do think that once you master how to fight Midir, there aren't that many surprises in store for you. Furthermore, again, just a personal preference, I'd really rather be able to lock on. Of course you can technically do this, but it's not at all advisable. Locking on makes proper engagement extremely difficult, and the best way to approach him is locked off. Fortunately, as far as free aim engagements go, he works pretty well, so it's less of a nuisance than it is in other encounters. Let's move on to Placidusax. Before I do though, if you like my video, please consider subscribing. I do three main types of Soulsborne content here: video analysis essays like this one, challenge runs like no damage taken fights, and guides. If any of that appeals to you, I'd love for you to join this community. Anyway, back to Placidusax. There's a lot to like here, but also a decent amount I don't find as compelling. Aesthetically, I think they knocked it out of the park. The cutscene is phenomenal, and the opening visuals of him in the center of the epic arena are pitch perfect. Placidusax's fight has moments of genius, and they tend to map onto his periods of activity. I generally enjoy the delayed lightning strikes across the arena because I like moves that make you be conscious of positional spacing. so long as they aren't overly taxing and annoying, and these aren't, so these check that box for me. His teleportation is also a mark in his favor. It's clearly telegraphed, so it doesn't feel unfair, and his clunky yet lightning fast descent and swipe moves look awesome and are a pleasure to dodge. Placiduous Axe is a bit of a paradox, because he requires simultaneously too much standing around and too much running away. When he's not active, which is pretty often, you just kind of have to stand there and wail on him. Conversely, many of his attacks entail carpeting the arena in undodgeable flames that you have to evade simply by running away, which is, to me, the most uninteresting form of engagement. His lightning bolt explosion is one of the most visually arresting attacks in the game. The pure spectacle of it, the way the music suddenly stops and is supplanted by an ominous, piercing reverberation, is brilliant. The downside, however, is that, again, you react by running away, which militates against some of its positive attributes. Overall, Placiduous Axe is a strong boss encounter. While I'm putting it last of the three, please do keep in mind that I'm still calling it a top 3 encounter, which I think is a pretty good accolade. Then we come to Bayle, an imperfect masterpiece. Bayle is, without question, the most dynamic and complex of these encounters. If anything, I've seen criticism of just how complicated and chaotic the fight is. I think this criticism is fair depending on the kind of player you are. I'm someone who likes to sit around and deeply learn a boss and struggle for mastery. Bayle, like many DLC bosses, demands that. If that's not your jam, I think that's completely legit, and yeah, you're probably not gonna like him very much. But for me, he's god tier. Bayle marries all the best components of his predecessors and requires you to use all of the tools in your kit. Bayle manages to preserve that feeling of constant motion that distinguishes Midir, but brings it to the next level. Dragons should be able to vault around and lurch large distances, and he does, but he does so in such a way that you rarely need to stand around or run that much. His tail swipe is a great example. He vaults across the arena, but pivots on an axis, does a massive tail swipe, and immediately ends up right back in your face. Similarly, if you stray too far away, he has a number of devastating but fairly telegraphed charge attacks to close that distance. Diagonal Fire Breath in Phase 1 tests your ability to slightly delay your dodging, and indeed so do his wing swipe combos, which can branch in different directions, but ones that are ultimately quite learnable. Phase 2 is the real achievement though. The visuals for me are just top notch. I find the entire encounter just absolutely stunning to look at. The emphasis on positioning in this phase is the most potent. Let me give you one example using his downward wing slam. When he brings his wing down, a streak of exploding lightning will emanate out perpendicular to his body. You can double dodge this, dodging first the slam and then the explosion, but this will consume stamina and detract from your counterattack window. However, if you simply walk modestly to your side as the attack is winding up, you actually only need to dodge the slam, and then the lightning will explode without hitting you right next to you, no additional evasion necessary, giving you a perfect counter-attack opportunity. You can see here that I pulled it off on the first swing. I actually had it on the second swing as well, but the camera got a bit janky and I panicked and rolled, even though it wasn't actually necessary, and we'll get to the camera in the next section. Bayle as a whole, though, is definitely not perfect, and parts of this fight feel unpolished and unfinished. The Phase 2 transition can be very janky. He can go behind the horizon of the cliff, causing you to lose sight and lock off, leaving you very disoriented and almost guaranteeing you'll get hit. What's worse, these fireballs can actually magically travel through the rock and hit you, which just feels like an unacceptable glitch that should be patched immediately. The flame jet he can use as an opening attack is a bit inconsistent as well, and while it might be technically fair, the granularity of the cues that dictate why you can get hit by dodging the same way and at the same time as other instances where you won't get hit is minuscule to the extreme. The camera is not without faults either, but I'll address that in the next section. The sheer genius and pleasure of Bayle's fight is ultimately locked behind a requirement for deep mastery and great patience. It's an impediment that many won't want to overcome, or might feel like they can't overcome. But with patience, anyone can overcome it, and when the door is unlocked and you can knowingly react to his moves, that is when the mechanical brilliance of this fight reveals itself. I do also now want to talk a little bit about the evolution of camera dynamics with respect to large bosses. Now, I don't have any insider information, obviously, so this is pure speculation on my part, but I think there's reasonable deduction here. I think the difficulty From Software has faced over the years with these kinds of fights is how to balance playability on the one hand with experiential verisimilitude on the other. What do I mean by that? Well, these are big enemies of whom your character would stand in awe. Their massive scale relative to your body is the key to instilling that awful dread, and so a sense of that scale needs to be preserved and conveyed on the screen to the player. Given how awkward these fights have historically been, From Software's pertinacious insistence on keeping them for over a decade suggests to me that this sense of relative scale is deeply important to them. The problem, of course, is that in real life, we can flick our eyes up in a fraction of a second, and we can do this with virtually zero effort or consciousness. In a game, the opposite is true. It requires a conscious, inefficient action on our part to adjust the camera constantly, so scale and ease of player dynamics wind up being mutually antagonistic to each other, and therein lies the problem. The scale, alongside just being generally visually awkward, often prevents you from locking on. Now, this is more or less an issue depending on personal preference. I've encountered plenty of people who don't mind free aiming, which is totally valid. Personally, I detest it. I am not good at it, and I don't like having to worry about factoring camera management into encounters that are already very cognitively demanding. If you say it's a skill issue, guess what? You're totally right. I am not skilled at it. However, what I'd say in response is that these games don't set you up to be skilled at it. 95% of enemies in Souls games are perfectly optimized for lock-on, so the games do not demand the cultivation of the skill of free aiming. For that reason, while I don't think you have to criticize a boss for not being lockable, I also think you certainly can criticize them for it. The best effort prior to Shadow of the Erdtree was the Divine Dragon in Sekiro. Let me be clear, I'm not saying it's the best dragon fight, I'm saying it was the most inventive attempt at a solution to the scale versus visual ease problem that I'm discussing. In that fight, you zoomed out quite a bit, but that only worked because you were supposed to feel far away during the lightning phase. Up close, shrinking the perspective like that would diminish the sense of scale that I was talking about, which I think is why they have never made an entire fight where the entire thing is just zoomed out. That would diminish the scale, which obviously just has to be super important to them because they keep doing the same thing over and over again. The base game of Elden Ring has quite a few dragons that play fairly well with the camera in certain circumstances. Upon closer inspection, however, this only works under very circumscribed parameters that have been carefully curated for these encounters and often fall apart quite quickly. Looking at a Giel or Smaragd, for example, we see a few things. First, the camera dynamics only work well when you're facing the head at mid or close range. It's very easy to get trapped under him, and the whole thing just falls apart. Second, when they're working well, the dragon will typically only do body moves that move forward with fairly limited move sets like bite, stomps, or horizontal wing swipes. Again, once it does something else, the lock-on system fails. Third, it requires a standardized, elongated body shape. I find these dragons fun to do overall, but they're not that complex, they tend to have a lot of redundancy, and the locking on system only works sometimes, and then other times we kind of revert back to the same old problems. So a little bit of an innovation, but not very much. Placiduous X doesn't really have any camera innovation either. You basically have to fight him unlocked. Locking on is useful after his crash landing when he does a series of localized teleportation swipes, but outside of that, his body is really too bulky and awkward for locking on to be anything but detrimental. Bayle represents FromSoft's attempt at a solution to this quandary. It's by no means perfect, but the vision is brilliant. When it works well, the camera snaps back around quickly whenever Bayle does a move that turns him around, or winds up obscuring our view with a girthier part of his body. The result is the preservation of that sense of scale, while also fostering a visual fluidity that makes locking on a viable strategy, which is awesome for someone like me. Unfortunately, what we have feels more like a beta than a finished product. The camera sometimes swings too slowly, leading you to counterattack in the wrong direction like I do here. Sometimes it doesn't even work at all, especially on this aerial body slam where your entire view winds up being obscured. This is really bad because it's a prime opportunity for a big counterattack to the head, And basically, you can't learn it by seeing it. You just kind of have to intuit it and know that you can do it, which is not very pleasurable, and is also probably not something that the average player is going to know how to do. Nonetheless, on the whole, I think the system works well, and it harkens a potential new and fruitful direction for large enemies that I'm extremely excited to see them pursue. So, yeah, that's about it for me. I hope you enjoyed my discussion of the dragons in the Souls catalog. Please leave a comment below with your opinions and thoughts about this, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Thanks.